Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign has actually raised $18 million in the second quarter of 2019. That's roughly the same period by the Sanders campaign in the first quarter when he led all the candidates. The Vermont senator is also transferring $6 million from his Senate reelection campaign into his presidential campaign. He's actually the second Democratic candidate to release his second quarter fundraising numbers after South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg raised $24.8 million in the second quarter. And yesterday on CBSN's Red and Blue, my colleague Tanya Rivero asked Sanders campaign manager Faz Shukir why Sanders' numbers would not exceed Buttigieg's total.
I think he will probably have more money raised than we will, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact of how he is raising his money. Bernie Sanders does not go into closed-door, high-dollar fundraisers and solicit money from corporate executives at their homes. That's the choice he's decided to make because he believes that you need a grassroots campaign to fundamentally change the policies that afflict working Americans.
Sanders' fundraising announcement comes as polls show that his support's actually decreasing. A recent CNN poll put Sanders in fourth place at 14%. That's behind Joe Biden, Senator Kamala Harris, and Senator Elizabeth Warren. I want to bring in CBSN's Caitlin Huey-Burns on set and Antjuan Seawright in Los Angeles. Caitlin, of course, a CBSN political reporter, and Antjuan, a CBSN political contributor and Democratic strategist. So, given these numbers, I mean, you look at these polling numbers for Sanders, can he turn this around?
Well, when Sanders got into this race, he was doing well in the polls and he had really strong fundraising. So the big question we had was whether he could sustain and grow that support. So now we're getting some answers. He's falling behind in the polls, especially as especially as voters start to look at other candidates, particularly Elizabeth Warren, who has been cutting into his lead in a lot of these polls. And his numbers in terms of fundraising have pretty much stayed from quarter to quarter. So he raised $18 million this quarter. The campaign also transferred $6 million from his Senate campaign. And to do that, they wanted to show that they're still competitive. But if you look at the raw total, he's really not raising more money than he was before. So this is a similar situation that we've been talking about with Joe Biden is, yes, they're leading in polls, but how soft is that support? And Bernie Sanders really in 2016, carved out a place for himself by talking about a lot of policies that were once considered, out of left field. Right. Now they're mainstream in the party, and he's been having to try to figure out ways to reestablish himself as the leader when it comes to those ideas like Medicare for all, college tuition payments, and the like. And in the debate, he didn't really have a standout moment.
So true.
Instead, people like Elizabeth Warren and others were able to use that platform to break through.
So the debates may have played a little bit into it as well. Antjuan, it's not just also the fundraising numbers. When you look at the height of Sanders' campaign in 2016, his favorability was at 60% based on CNN data now. It's at 44% according to their polling. He's viewed unfavorably about Democrats. This is really for the first time. Do we know what's kind of driving that decline in support? And what's his campaign say?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, the 2020 presidential preference primary is totally different than the 2016. In 2016, he was pretty much one-on-one with Hillary Clinton. No African Americans in the race, no real sense of urgency about the moment I think we have in history. This time it's totally different. The other thing is you have Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders trying to drive the same message down the political highway. It seems as if, to me, she is really passing him on the highway, and he is falling behind. Not to mention you have Mayor Pete, who is also eating away at Bernie Sanders' support. So I think the math problem he had in 2016 has carried over to 2020 with his support among African Americans. And now you have two other candidates and many other candidates who are eating away at some of the same policy agenda items that he has advocated for. So I think that's part of the problem. And the other piece is you have Joe Biden in the race, who has consistently been, kind of the middle class messenger in this race. And regardless of what picture the media paints, the party is still center left. And so when you have that and you have a real comparison of the two, you have what you have, and you can't underestimate Kamala Harris and the support she will garner and has generated from African-American women in particular. And when you combine all those things, you get a problem for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, and she did well in the debates, too. I mean, clearly people noticed. Caitlin, you've got Sanders' support also dwindling in Iowa, which has got to be problematic. I mean, I'm looking at this USA Today poll. It shows him just 9% at 9% total, in a very crucial state early on.
Right, exactly, especially when he came less than a percentage point away from winning it in 2016. I mean, Antjuan brings up a really good point that this is a completely different kind of field. Now, Sanders himself has said, look, you don't need to win every primary or caucus. You just need to come away with a certain percentage to garner delegates, right? Because they're awarded proportionally. But especially in a place like Iowa, if you're Sanders and you're not leading there, which is where you kind of made a name for yourself in the first go round, able to speak to a specific constituency, Elizabeth Warren landed in Iowa very early on this cycle. It was her first campaign stop in January, and since then she has been slowly building up an organization there, one of the biggest and most robust organizations in Iowa that we've seen out of all of the campaigns, and that is starting to show in her poll numbers. And talking to voters on the ground there, they do like Bernie, they like a lot of the things that he's saying, but they're so interested now in all of these other new candidates, and they're also putting a premium on electability. Even if they don't know exactly what that means.
Why is that so important?
Even if they don't know exactly what that means, they don't always associate it with Sanders. And that's something his campaign has been trying to drive over and over. You heard that in the interview in Red and Blue, talking about his poll numbers compared to that of Donald Trump leading there. But still, that's a message that needs to resonate with voters, and it hasn't quite already.
Antjuan, I've got to ask you about these fundraising numbers for Mayor Pete Buttigieg, $24.8 million. That's really an impressive figure. But CNN has him pulling at 0% among Black voters. He actually addressed that earlier today. I want to play that for you.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of voters I need to get to know and who need to get to know me. They need to understand the details of the Douglas plan that we're continuing to roll out. And frankly, they need to see me in action for a longer period of time. Look, when you're new on the scene and you're not from a community of color, you got to work much harder in order to earn that trust, because trust is largely a function of quantity time. I'm committed to doing that work. But I think the most important question is, will our policy benefit Black Americans and all Americans? And if that happens, and if I can show that, I think the politics will start to take care of themselves.
So, Antjuan, when you talk about that coalition of voters out there for Buttigieg, is it enough to sort of catapult him to the next level?
Look, I think that he's going to be in the race long term simply by way of the money he's raising and will continue to raise. However, I do think he has the Bernie Sanders problem of 2016, a math problem with the African-American voters. And make no mistake, yes, time is a factor, and yes, he's new on the scene, but a lot of it has to do with relationships. A lot of it has to do with validators in these individual communities, and a lot of it has everything to do with South Carolina, the most important state, I think, in the primary, considering the demographics, 60% African-American, 55% women. If you look at what happens after South Carolina, those demographics continue to trend even more that way. And so while Mayor Pete has to block and tackle, he also has to run some plays up front in order to gain some traction in the African-American community, or he will not be able to survive. I think if I were him, I would spend less time building my national profile and spend more time trying to zero in on these states and places where I know I have a math problem, and that is with the African-American vote.
Caitlin, I want to ask you also for a second about these fundraising numbers as well. In particular, when you look at for the RNC with the president, he's managed to raise $105 million in the second quarter. I mean, you compare that to a similar period for President Obama's re-election campaign. He had $85 million. What do you make of those numbers?
Well, the big advantage that Trump has is that he and his campaign have joined forces totally with the RNC.
Which Obama did not do.
Exactly, and that has made a huge difference because they have been proved themselves to be powerhouse fundraisers. And what really scares Democrats is that not only Trump is raising this money, but he's also slowly building a grassroots fundraising component as well. And talking to folks on the campaign, especially those working in the digital space, they are way ahead of Democrats because Democrats are in this long primary process where they're still trying to figure out their messaging. They're all kind of competing against each other. Meanwhile, Trump is running a general election campaign since the day he was inaugurated, basically, but now is fully in campaign mode. So talking to Democratic donors, they really want Democrats to keep up with this number, and the more candidates there are in the race means that they can't consolidate that kind of money as quickly as they want to.
But Caitlin, to your point, I think that's why Democrats have to be laser focused on a policy agenda and run for our party's nomination and not against each other. The infighting on the debate stage and in the media and the public doesn't help our cause when you think about long term. Not only is the top of the ticket responsible for trying to take back the White House, but we also have some down ballot races like keeping the Congress, like governor's races.
Yeah,
and after the Supreme Court decision that came down, state legislative races are going to be even more important. And so at the end of the day, it's nice and it's funny and it's cute to go after each other and hit each other hard, but we can't afford to be lumped or bruised going into a general election in which we see the Republicans start to consolidate and we're starting to continue to pull ourselves apart. Because I lived through 2016, in which I worked for Hillary Clinton all across this country, and when Republicans fell in line, Democrats fell in love, and it did not help our cause because not everyone rallied behind our candidate like we needed to.
You know, Antjuan, you talk about, working on Hillary Clinton's campaign. One of the angers sort of that the campaign had, Hillary Clinton's campaign had, and others running Democrats, was that there wasn't enough set up for the DNC when it came to money and helping down ballot tickets with the fundraising. So has anything changed this go round? Is that a lesson that the DNC has learned, or is it just impossible when you've got 20 plus candidates all vying for a piece of the pie?
Well, as I always tell you, there's no education in the second kick of the mule. And so if we did not learn a lesson in 2016, I think we're starting to see that play out now with the Republicans doing what they've been able to do to this point. I just hope at the end of this process that the DNC is building some needed infrastructure because they are the plumbing. I hope the individual committees, the DCCC, the DGA, the DLCC, and the DSCC are also building the needed and necessary infrastructure so we can combine resources. Once we get a nominee, rebuild our DNC to the point where whoever our candidate is will put their resources and infrastructure and their team there, and we're able to really fight a big general election campaign. Because I will tell you, I thought 16 was important, and I thought 8 and 12 was important, but this perhaps will be the most transformational election of my political lifetime, and there's so much at stake, and we see it play out every single day, every time we see a tweet from the president.
The importance of elections. I want to ask you, Caitlin, we've seen many candidates put out their immigration policies. Cory Booker put one out. We know a lot of them are focusing on these detention facilities.
Right.
But when we looked at one of our polls from last month, it shows immigration is actually behind healthcare, the economy, gun policy for voters. We know the president wants immigration to be a focus, but is this a winning strategy for Democrats and to mobilize interest in voters?
Well, during the debate, we saw it start to come to the forefront. First, it was held in Miami, where immigration is always a big issue, just given the demographics there. But also, you had that Homestead facility that nearly all the candidates who were in Miami for the debate went to go visit that detention center to draw attention to it. But talking to immigration advocates and activists, they have told me that, look, Democrats need more than just a policy against Donald Trump when it comes to immigration, and they're starting to roll that out. You mentioned Cory Booker's plan today. Julian Castro also made some waves in the party last week during the debate by calling for decriminalizing illegal border crossings. That's something that Cory Booker and others have signed on to as well. And that's also something that, talking to the Trump campaign, they believe that feeds right into their message. They want to paint all Democrats as supporting lax immigration policies, and whether that's fair, they believe that the debates gave them some fodder. And so Democrats are kind of in this tricky position where they want to show their own policies. They want to show that they're against Trump's policies, especially on such an emotional issue. But at the same time, Trump has proven to be successful at running on this because it's an issue his base cares about, not so much for Democrats.
Hey, but Caitlin, one thing that Democrats cannot afford to do, we cannot afford to get caught up in the Republican narrative. Of course, they want to make immigration their top line issue because, look, Trump ended his campaign in 2016 making it a red meat, right-wing racial issue when it comes to immigration, and he's starting this campaign the same way. So that's what he wants to do. But I think Democrats have to listen to the American people, particularly independent thinkers and independent voters, and our base when we want to focus on quality of life issues like like healthcare, like the economy, like housing, all those things that make people go to bed worrying at night and make people get up in the morning also still worried because they did not solve the answers from yesterday. And I think that we have to do that in such a way, as we did in the midterms, that we bring out our voters and bring along some of the Trump voters too. Because if we let the Republicans paint the picture of what we should be talking about, we will lose every single time, because Republicans will use the immigration issue as a way to galvanize and energize their base, and we will forget about what's important to our voters, and we will find ourselves back in the minority in the House and on the other side of history when it comes to winning the White House in 2020.
All right, on that note, I'm going to have to leave it there. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Antjuan Seawright, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.